The textbook hit the linoleum floor with a sharp thud that echoed through Riverside Hall's third-floor corridor. Zoe Nakamura, 24 and coffee-stained, stood frozen in her dorm room doorway, her heart hammering against her ribs as black-clad figures descended from helicopters outside her window. Across the narrow hallway, Navy SEAL Captain Ryan Blackwood stepped through the emergency exit, his voice cutting through the humid California evening air like a blade. "We need Sergeant Nakamura. Where is she?" The entire floor went silent. Even the perpetual hum of the ancient air conditioning seemed to pause. Her floormates, Blake, Aria, and Ethan, suddenly found their phones fascinating. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Nobody had called her sergeant in 3 years. Nobody even knew that title existed. Zoe had spent countless hours perfecting her cover as just another overwhelmed Mountain View University student struggling through her mechanical engineering degree. Her dorm room looked like any other. Textbooks scattered across an unmade bed, instant ramen containers stacked on a mini-fridge, motivational posters hiding the institutional beige walls. But beneath her mattress, wrapped in an old hoodie, lay items that would have made her floormates' heads spin. Commendations from classified operations, photographs with faces she could never discuss, and a medal she'd earned in a place that didn't officially exist. Aria Rodriguez, her roommate of 2 years, emerged from their shared room with wet hair and a towel around her shoulders, clearly fresh from the communal showers. "What's with all the noise out here? I'm trying to study for Professor Winter's organic chemistry final and—" She stopped mid-sentence as she registered the tactical gear, night vision goggles, and weapons that marked these men as something far beyond campus security. Captain Blackwood's steel-gray eyes swept the hallway, taking in every face, every door, every potential threat or escape route with the calculated precision Zoe remembered from her own training. His team flanked him in perfect formation. Petty Officer First Class Nina Harper covering the stairwell, Master Sergeant Alex Kane positioned near the elevator, and 2 other operators whose names Zoe didn't recognize, but whose posture screamed special operations. "Ladies and gentlemen," Blackwood announced, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to life-and-death obedience, "we're looking for someone who should be on this floor. Former Marine Force Reconnaissance, Explosive Ordnance Disposal Specialist, multiple tours in Afghanistan and Iraq. Goes by Zoe Nakamura now, but her service record shows Sergeant Isabella Nakamura Chen." The blood drained from her face. Isabella, the name she'd legally changed 3 years ago when she'd walked away from everything, the adrenaline, the brotherhood, the constant edge of mortal danger that had defined her identity since she was 18. Her hands trembled as she gripped her biochemistry textbook, the same hands that had once diffused IEDs under enemy fire and coordinated precision strikes in hostile territory. Blake Morrison stepped forward, his lanky frame and wire-rimmed glasses making him look even younger than his 22 years. "Sir, I think there might be some confusion. This is Riverside Hall, Mountain View University. We're all just students here, finals week, you know. Nobody here has any military background." Captain Blackwood's expression didn't change, but Zoe caught the slight tightening around his eyes that meant he was running out of patience. "Son, I appreciate your concern for your fellow students, but I need you to understand something. 6 hours ago, a situation developed that requires immediate consultation with someone who has very specific expertise, the kind of expertise that's not taught in classrooms." Zoe felt the familiar knot forming in her stomach, the same sensation she'd experienced countless times in Afghanistan when intelligence reports suggested an imminent attack. Her instincts, dormant for 3 years of deliberately peaceful campus life, began awakening despite her desperate attempts to suppress them. What kind of situation? The question left her lips before she could stop herself. Every head in the hallway turned towards her, and she realized she'd just revealed more knowledge than any regular college student should possess. Blackwood's attention focused on her with laser intensity. The kind where asking questions means you already know more than you're letting on. He stepped closer, and Zoe caught the scent of tactical gear oil and helicopter fuel that transported her instantly back to forward operating bases and pre-dawn briefings.
The kind where innocent people die if we don't find the right expertise in the next 12 hours. Professor Helen Winters chose that moment to emerge from the stairwell, her graying hair disheveled and her usually composed demeanor clearly rattled. As the floor's resident advisor and Zoe's favorite mechanical engineering instructor, she commanded respect from students and faculty alike. But seeing armed military personnel in her residential building had obviously shaken her usual academic confidence.
Gentlemen, I'm going to need to see some identification and understand why you're disrupting my students during finals week, she said, her voice steady despite the circumstances. This is a university dormitory, not a military installation. Master Sergeant Kane stepped forward, producing credentials that made Professor Winter's eyes widen. Ma'am, we're operating under emergency authorization from the Department of Defense. We're not here to disrupt anyone's education. We just need to locate someone who can help prevent a significant loss of life. Ethan Cross, usually the most outspoken student on the floor, found his voice despite the obvious intimidation. Look, we all know each other pretty well here. Nobody's hiding some secret military background. Zoe's in my advanced thermodynamics class. She struggles with the same problem sets we all do. She's not some, he gestured vaguely at the tactical team, whatever you're looking for. The comment stung more than Zoe expected. Struggles with problem sets. If only they knew that she deliberately performed at median levels to avoid attention, that the thermodynamics principles they found challenging were child's play compared to calculating blast radii and trajectory physics under combat conditions. Actually, Aria interjected, her voice thoughtful despite the chaos, now that I think about it, Zoe does have some weird habits. All eyes turned to her, and Zoe felt panic rising in her chest. She never sleeps through the night. I hear her pacing sometimes, and she always checks the locks on our door 3 times before bed. And she knows things about current events that don't match up with just reading the news. Zoe silently cursed her roommate's observational skills. 3 years of careful normalcy, and Aria had noticed the hypervigilance that never quite faded from combat veterans' nervous systems. Captain Blackwood studied Zoe with renewed interest. Ms. Nakamura, would you mind if we had a private conversation? The use of her chosen name rather than her military designation felt like both a kindness and a trap. Zoe looked around at her floormates, people who knew her as the quiet engineering student who helped with study groups and never missed Professor Winter's office hours, people who had no idea that she'd once been responsible for clearing explosive devices from school buildings in Kandahar, or that she trained local forces in techniques that saved countless civilian lives. I think you have the wrong person, she said quietly, her voice barely audible over the building's ancient ventilation system. I'm just a student. I'm trying to graduate and get a normal job and live a normal life. The words felt hollow even as she spoke them. Normal had never fit her, not even before the military. She joined the Marines at 18 because normal felt like a slow death, and she left the Marines 3 years ago because abnormal started feeling like a fast one. Sergeant Nakamura, Blackwood said, his voice gentler but no less insistent. 6 hours ago, someone planted an explosive device in the basement of Jefferson Elementary School in San Francisco. 734 children are inside that building. The device is sophisticated, military grade, with a timer mechanism that's unlike anything local law enforcement has encountered. The floor seemed to tilt beneath Zoe's feet. Children. Always children. The one thing that had driven her to excel beyond anyone's expectations during her service years. She joined EOD specifically because explosive devices threaten the most vulnerable populations, and she left the Marines because watching children suffer had finally broken something fundamental in her psyche. Actually, Nina Hamper spoke for the first time since the team's arrival, the bomb squad has been working on it for 4 hours. They've identified components that suggest the person who built this device has significant military training and access to restricted materials. But the configuration is unusual. It's like someone took standard military ordnance and modified it in ways that don't match any known terrorist playbook.
Zoe closed her eyes, her mind automatically processing the tactical information, despite her desperate desire to remain uninvolved. Military-grade components with unusual modifications suggested either a rogue operative or someone with enough expertise to innovate beyond standard protocols. The timer mechanism indicated planning and precision rather than random violence. "Why me?" she asked, opening her eyes to meet Blackwood's steady gaze. "Even if I were who you think I am, there are dozens of active-duty EOD specialists who could handle this." "Because," Blackwood replied, "the device signature matches 3 unsolved cases from your deployment area in Afghanistan, cases where innovative explosive configurations were used against coalition forces. Cases that were never solved because the person responsible seemed to understand our standard disarmament procedures and had modified their devices specifically to counter them." The knot in Zoe's stomach tightened into a cold fist of recognition. She remembered those devices, the ones that had killed Staff Sergeant Martinez and wounded Lieutenant Collins, the ones that had haunted her sleep for months before she'd finally tracked down their source.
Ahmad Hassan, she whispered, the name emerging from memories she'd tried desperately to bury. Captain Blackwood nodded grimly. Ahmad Hassan. Confirmed sighting in San Francisco 2 weeks ago. We believe he's specifically targeting the school because of its proximity to the naval base where several of his former associates are being held. Professor Winters looked back and forth between Zoe and the military team, her academic mind clearly struggling to process the implications. "Zoe, what is he talking about? Who is Ahmad Hassan?" Zoe felt the careful walls she'd built around her past 3 years crumbling like poorly mixed concrete. Her floormates stared at her with mixtures of confusion, curiosity, and growing realization that the person they thought they knew had been concealing something enormous. "Ahmad Hassan," she said slowly, her voice carrying the weight of buried trauma, was an explosives expert who worked with insurgent forces in Afghanistan. He specialized in creating devices that were specifically designed to kill the people trying to disarm them. He killed friends of mine." The hallway fell completely silent except for the distant sound of helicopter rotors still circling outside. Zoe looked at each familiar face. Aria, with her organic chemistry notes still clutched in her hand, Blake with his computer science textbooks scattered around his feet, Ethan with his engineering calculator still clipped to his belt, Professor Winters with her red pen poised over what looked like final exam drafts. These were the people who represented the normal life she'd tried so hard to build, the quiet existence where the most dangerous thing she faced was oversleeping for a thermodynamics exam or running out of meal plan credits before the semester ended. But in the distance, barely audible through the building's thick walls, she could hear sirens. And somewhere in San Francisco, 734 children were sitting in classrooms above a device that could end their lives if she chose to protect her carefully constructed anonymity over their safety. Captain Blackwood seemed to read her internal struggle. "Sergeant, I know what you sacrificed to build the life you have here, but right now you're the only person on the West Coast who has successfully disarmed one of Hassan's devices. Those children don't have time for us to fly in specialists from Virginia or coordinate with international experts." Zoe looked down at her hands, the same hands that had defused dozens of explosive devices under enemy fire, that had saved countless lives through steady nerves and precise technical knowledge. For 3 years, she'd used those hands only for turning textbook pages and taking lecture notes. But muscle memory didn't fade, and neither did the moral obligation that had driven her to serve in the first place. "If I help you," she said quietly, "my cover here is blown. Everyone will know who I used to be. The life I've built," she gestured around the familiar dorm hallway, "all of this goes away." "Maybe," Professor Winters said unexpectedly, her voice carrying the wisdom of someone who'd spent decades watching young people navigate impossible choices. "Zoe, or Isabella, or whoever you really are, you're still the person who helped me pass calculus when I was ready to drop out. You're still the person who listens to my problems at 2 in the morning and never judges me for being dramatic. I don't care what you did before college. I care about who you are now." Blake nodded emphatically. "And right now, you're someone who can save children's lives. That seems pretty important compared to protecting your GPA or whatever." The weight of their acceptance hit her harder than she expected. For 3 years, she'd assumed revealing her military background would create distance between her and the civilian world she tried to join.
But looking around at faces that showed concern rather than judgment, support rather than fear, she began to understand that she'd been protecting herself from reactions that might never have materialized. Captain Blackwood checked his watch with military precision. "Sergeant, I need a decision. The timer on that device is counting down whether we're here or not." Zoe straightened her shoulders, feeling familiar muscles engage in patterns she hadn't used since her last deployment. The scared college student who had been caught off guard began transforming back into the confident Marine who had once been trusted with the most dangerous assignments in one of the world's most hostile environments. "Give me 5 minutes to change into appropriate gear," she said, her voice carrying a new authority that surprised her even. "And I need a complete briefing on the device specifications during transport." As she turned toward her dorm room, Professor Winters called after her, "Zoe, your thermodynamics final is scheduled for Thursday morning." Zoe paused, looking back at the life she was about to leave behind, at least temporarily. "Professor, I think I've been studying the wrong kind of applied physics anyway."
The 5 minutes Zoe had requested stretched into an eternity as she stood alone in her dorm room, surrounded by the carefully constructed evidence of her civilian identity. Her hands shook as she reached under her mattress, pushing aside the organic chemistry study guides and thermodynamics problem sets that had consumed her thoughts just hours earlier. The manila envelope felt heavier than she remembered, weighted with memories she'd spent 3 years trying to bury. Inside lay the remnants of Sergeant Isabella Nakamura Chen. Commendations from operations she could never discuss, photographs with faces obscured by classification requirements, and a Purple Heart she'd earned during her 3rd deployment when an IED had torn through her convoy outside Kandahar. The metal felt cold against her palm, a tangible reminder of the moment her perspective on mortality had shifted permanently. "Zoe?" Aria's voice drifted through their thin dorm room door. "Do you need help with anything?" The concern in her roommate's tone almost broke Zoe's carefully maintained composure. For 2 years, Aria had been the closest thing to a normal friend she had managed to cultivate. Late-night conversations about boyfriends and career anxieties, shared meals in the dining hall, collaborative study sessions that had nothing to do with life-or-death scenarios. These had been the building blocks of the peaceful existence she'd tried to create. "I'm okay," Zoe called back, though the words felt like ash in her mouth. She pulled her military-issued duffel bag from the back of her closet, behind the formal dresses she'd worn to exactly 3 university social events. The bag still smelled faintly of desert sand and equipment oil, scents that immediately transported her back to forward operating bases and pre-dawn mission briefings. Her civilian clothes, the carefully chosen outfits that helped her blend in with other engineering students, suddenly felt like costumes she'd been wearing in an elaborate performance. She changed into dark jeans and a black long-sleeve shirt, practical clothing that wouldn't restrict movement or catch on equipment. The transformation felt both foreign and familiar, like slipping back into a language she'd forced herself to forget. A soft knock interrupted her preparations. "Zoe, it's Professor Winters. May I come in?" Zoe opened the door to find her favorite instructor standing in the hallway, her usually composed academic demeanor replaced by something more personal. Professor Winters had been more than just an educator over the past 2 years. She'd been a mentor who'd encouraged Zoe's mechanical engineering pursuits and never questioned why someone her age seemed to have gaps in her educational timeline. "I wanted to talk to you before you left," Professor Winters said, stepping into the small room. Her eyes took in the military duffel bag, the transformation in Zoe's clothing, and the manila envelope of military documents spread across the unmade bed. "How long have you been carrying this secret?" 3 years, 4 months, and 16 days, Zoe replied automatically, then caught herself. "I mean, since I started at Mountain View. Since I decided to try being normal." Professor Winters sat carefully on Aria's desk chair, her movements deliberate and thoughtful. "Zoe, in my 23 years of teaching, I've learned to recognize students who are running from something, but I've also learned to recognize students who are running towards something better. You've always struck me as the latter." The observation cut deeper than Zoe had expected. "I joined the Marines at 18 because I wanted to make a difference.
I left at 21 because making a difference was killing me, literally and figuratively. Coming here was supposed to be about building something new, something that didn't involve, she gestured toward the purple heart lying on her bedspread. Something that didn't involve using your extraordinary talents to save lives? Professor Winter's voice carried the gentle challenge that had made her such an effective educator. Zoe, I've watched you in my advanced mechanics courses. You don't just understand the principles we discuss. You internalize them in ways that suggest practical application far beyond textbook problems. Zoe sank onto her bed, the weight of 3 years of careful deception suddenly feeling unbearable. You suspected. I suspected you had experience that you weren't discussing. Many of our veteran students struggle with the transition from military to civilian life, though most don't feel the need to completely hide their service history. Professor Winters leaned forward, her expression compassionate but direct. What made your situation different? The question opened floodgates Zoe had been holding closed since her first day of college orientation. Because my military occupation specialty was killing people, Professor. Not in the abstract sense of supporting operations or maintaining equipment. I defused bombs that were specifically designed to kill the people trying to defuse them. I made split-second decisions that determined whether children lived or died. I was good at it, really good, and that scared me more than the actual danger. She stood and walked to her small window, looking out at the campus quad where students were studying under oak trees, completely absorbed in problems that had clear solutions and predictable outcomes. When I left the military, I wanted to use my engineering knowledge to build things instead of preventing their destruction. I wanted to solve problems that didn't involve human mortality. I wanted to be someone who helped people learn calculus, not someone who prevented them from being blown up. Professor Winters was quiet for a long moment, processing this revelation about a student she thought she knew well. And now?
Now 700 children are sitting above a device that could end their lives, and I'm the only person within 6 hours who has successfully disarmed similar devices. Zoe turned back toward her instructor, her voice carrying a resignation she hadn't felt since her final deployment. So, I guess I never really escaped who I was. I just postponed dealing with it. A commotion in the hallway interrupted their conversation. Through the thin walls, they could hear Captain Blackwood coordinating with his team and university administration. Dean Patricia Lawson's voice carried clearly as she discussed liability concerns and media management with someone who was obviously accustomed to much higher stakes than academic bureaucracy. "Miss Nakamura," came Captain Blackwood's voice through the door, "we need to move. The timer mechanism has accelerated beyond our initial projections." Zoe felt her military training override her civilian anxieties as adrenaline sharpened her focus. Time compression, a common modification to sophisticated explosive devices that created artificial urgency and increased the likelihood of mistakes during disarmament procedures. Ahmad Hassan had used similar techniques in Afghanistan, forcing EOD specialists to choose between speed and precision under impossible time constraints. "I'm coming," she called back, then turned to Professor Winters. "I need you to do something for me. If this goes badly, if I don't make it back, I need you to tell Blake, Aria, and Ethan that I'm sorry I lied to them. They deserve to know who I really was." Professor Winters stood and placed a firm hand on Zoe's shoulder. "You're going to come back and you're going to tell them yourself. But more importantly, you're going to discover that the person you've been for the past 3 years isn't separate from the person you were during your military service. You're going to learn that courage and compassion aren't diminished by trying to build a peaceful life." The words felt like a benediction Zoe hadn't realized she needed. She shouldered her duffel bag, tucked the manila envelope of military documents into her jacket, and took one last look around the dorm room that had represented safety and anonymity for 3 years. In the hallway, her floormates had gathered, despite the late hour and the obvious gravity of the situation. Blake held his laptop, probably researching EOD procedures and trying to understand what his study partner was actually capable of. Ethan clutched his advanced physics textbook, his expression mixing awe with confusion as he reconsidered every interaction they'd had over the past semester.
Aria stood closest to their door, her eyes red-rimmed but determined. "Zoe," Aria said, stepping forward, "I don't understand most of what's happening, but I understand that you're about to do something incredibly dangerous to save people you've never met." "That's what Marines do," Zoe replied, surprised by how easily the old identity settled back into place. "We serve others, especially those who can't protect themselves." Blake cleared his throat nervously. "When you come back, and you are coming back, maybe we could study together for Professor Chen's material science final. I mean, I'm guessing you probably know more about material stress analysis than you've been letting on." The comment drew a genuine smile from Zoe for the first time since the Navy SEALs had arrived. "Blake, I've been deliberately performing at median levels in that class. My actual knowledge might surprise you." Ethan laughed despite the tension. "I knew it! Nobody struggles that much with heat transfer calculations and then aces the practical applications section. You were hiding in plain sight." Captain Blackwood appeared in the doorway, his patience clearly exhausted by the emotional farewell scene. "Sergeant, we need to move now. The timer mechanism has entered its final countdown phase." Zoe felt her military training override her civilian anxieties as adrenaline sharpened her focus. Time compression, a common modification to sophisticated explosive devices that created artificial urgency and increased the likelihood of mistakes during disarmament procedures. Ahmad Hassan had used similar techniques in Afghanistan, forcing EOD specialists to choose between speed and precision under impossible time constraints. "I'm coming," she called back, then turned to Professor Winters. "I need you to do something for me. If this goes badly, if I don't make it back, I need you to tell Blake, Aria, and Ethan that I'm sorry I lied to them. They deserve to know who I really was." Professor Winters stood and placed a firm hand on Zoe's shoulder. "You're going to come back and you're going to tell them yourself. But more importantly, you're going to discover that the person you've been for the past 3 years isn't separate from the person you were during your military service. You're going to learn that courage and compassion aren't diminished by trying to build a peaceful life." The words felt like a benediction Zoe hadn't realized she needed. She shouldered her duffel bag, tucked the manila envelope of military documents into her jacket, and took one last look around the dorm room that had represented safety and anonymity for 3 years. In the hallway, her floormates had gathered, despite the late hour and the obvious gravity of the situation. Blake held his laptop, probably researching EOD procedures and trying to understand what his study partner was actually capable of. Ethan clutched his advanced physics textbook, his expression mixing awe with confusion as he reconsidered every interaction they'd had over the past semester. Aria stood closest to their door, her eyes red-rimmed but determined. "Zoe," Aria said, stepping forward, "I don't understand most of what's happening, but I understand that you're about to do something incredibly dangerous to save people you've never met." "That's what Marines do," Zoe replied, surprised by how easily the old identity settled back into place. "We serve others, especially those who can't protect themselves." Blake cleared his throat nervously. "When you come back, and you are coming back, maybe we could study together for Professor Chen's material science final. I mean, I'm guessing you probably know more about material stress analysis than you've been letting on." The comment drew a genuine smile from Zoe for the first time since the Navy SEALs had arrived. "Blake, I've been deliberately performing at median levels in that class. My actual knowledge might surprise you." Ethan laughed despite the tension. "I knew it! Nobody struggles that much with heat transfer calculations and then aces the practical applications section. You were hiding in plain sight." Captain Blackwood appeared in the doorway, his patience clearly exhausted by the emotional farewell scene. "Sergeant, we need to move now. The timer mechanism has entered its final countdown phase." Zoe nodded, feeling the familiar calm that had carried her through dozens of high-stakes operations. Time compression meant Hassan was either accelerating the timeline deliberately, or the device had encountered interference that was affecting its stability. Either scenario required immediate response and absolute precision. She was no longer a college student trying to pass thermodynamics. She was Sergeant Isabella Nakamura Chen, EOD specialist, walking back into the world she had tried to escape. But this time, she carried with her something she had lacked during her military service: the knowledge that courage could coexist with the desire for peace, and that strength could be expressed through building connections rather than just preventing destruction.
The helicopter's rotor wash whipped across the Mountain View University parking lot as Zoe climbed aboard the military transport, her civilian life literally shrinking beneath her as they lifted into the California night sky.
Captain Blackwood handed her a tactical headset and a manila folder thick with intelligence briefings, his expression grim in the red-filtered cabin lighting. "Sergeant, we've got a problem beyond the original parameters," he said, his voice cutting through the aircraft's mechanical noise. "The device isn't just sophisticated, it's personal. Hassan left a message specifically mentioning your unit designation from Afghanistan." Zoe's blood ran cold as she opened the folder. The first photograph showed the Jefferson Elementary School's basement, where a complex arrangement of wires, timers, and military-grade explosive components had been assembled with the kind of precision that spoke to years of experience and intimate knowledge of American EOD procedures. But it was the second photograph that made her hands shake. A handwritten note in Arabic script, taped directly to the device's primary timer. "What does it say?" she asked, though part of her already knew. Master Sergeant Kane leaned over from his position near the cabin door. "Our translators confirmed it roughly 3 hours ago. It says, 'For the daughter of the bomb maker who thinks she can build instead of destroy. Your American peace is an illusion. Choose. Save the children or save yourself, but you cannot do both.'" The helicopter banked sharply as they approached San Francisco, the city's lights spreading out beneath them like a circuit board. Zoe stared at the message, her mind racing through implications that went far beyond a simple terrorist attack. Hassan hadn't just planted a bomb, he'd crafted a psychological trap specifically designed to exploit her personal history and her attempts to build a civilian identity. "How does he know about my transition to civilian life? My military records are classified. My college enrollment was processed under sealed documentation." Captain Blackwood exchanged glances with Nina Harper before responding. "We believe Hassan has been tracking former EOD specialists who were active in his operational area. He's specifically targeting people who left military service and attempted to integrate into civilian communities. This is the 4th attack in 18 months. The revelation hit Zoe like a physical blow. 4th attack? What happened to the others? 2 specialists in Colorado and Virginia successfully disarmed similar devices, but both had their civilian identities completely destroyed in the process. Media coverage, congressional investigations, community backlash against hidden military assets living among civilian populations. Nina's voice carried a bitterness that suggested personal experience with media scrutiny. The 3rd specialist, in Oregon, chose to maintain his civilian cover rather than respond to the crisis. "And?" Zoe asked, though the silence that followed provided its own answer. 14 children died when the device detonated during a school assembly. The specialist, former Staff Sergeant Michael Chen, committed suicide 6 weeks later. The guilt of choosing personal safety over innocent lives destroyed him. The information settled in Zoe's stomach like lead. Hassan wasn't just attacking American communities. He was systematically destroying the post-military lives of people who had served in Afghanistan, forcing them to choose between their carefully constructed civilian identities and their moral obligations to protect innocent lives. "So, this is a no-win scenario," Zoe said, her voice steady despite the churning emotions. "Either I save the children and lose the life I've built at Mountain View, or I protect my civilian identity and carry the guilt of their deaths forever." "There might be a third option," Captain Blackwood said, though his tone suggested limited optimism. "If we can trace Hassan's current location through the device's communication protocols, we might be able to apprehend him before he can orchestrate additional attacks or destroy evidence of your involvement." The helicopter began its descent toward a staging area several blocks from Jefferson Elementary. Through the cabin windows, Zoe could see the perimeter that had been established around the school. Fire trucks, police vehicles, FBI command units, and media vans creating concentric circles of official response and public spectacle. "How many reporters?" she asked, recognizing the media presence as another layer of Hassan's psychological strategy. 17 news crews at last count, including national networks, Nina replied. "Hassan called in anonymous tips to major outlets 3 hours ago, claiming that a secret military operative would be responding to the crisis. He's ensuring maximum exposure for your involvement." Zoe felt her carefully constructed anonymity crumbling in real time. Even if she successfully disarmed the device, her face would be broadcast across every major news network, her military service record would be investigated and publicized, and her attempts to build a peaceful civilian existence would become a matter of public scrutiny and debate. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
The helicopter touched down in the parking lot of a closed shopping center where a mobile command unit had been established to coordinate the response. As Zoe disembarked, she was immediately surrounded by FBI agents, local law enforcement officials, and military personnel whose faces reflected the gravity of the situation. Agent Rebecca Walsh, the FBI's lead investigator on the case, approached with a grim expression. "Sergeant Nakamura-chen, thank you for responding. We've had our best people working on this device for 6 hours and we've made zero progress. The configuration is unlike anything in our databases." Zoe accepted the tactical gear being offered by a Navy EOD technician: helmet, protective vest, communication equipment, and a toolkit that felt familiar despite 3 years of disuse. "Agent Walsh, I need to understand something before I proceed. How many people here know about my civilian identity? How many know that I've been living as a college student?" The question seemed to catch the agent off guard. At this point, approximately 40 personnel across multiple agencies have been briefed on your background. We've attempted to limit information distribution, but operational security requires... It requires that my cover be completely blown, Zoe finished. "I understand. This was never about saving my civilian life. Hassan made sure of that from the moment he left that note." Agent Walsh's expression softened slightly. "Sergeant, I won't lie to you. This situation will fundamentally change your ability to maintain anonymity. But I will promise you this. If you help us save those children, the full resources of the federal government will be available to help you rebuild your life in whatever form you choose." Zoe looked around at the assembled law enforcement and military personnel, all of whom were depending on expertise she'd spent 3 years trying to forget. In the distance, she could see the Jefferson Elementary School building, its windows glowing warmly in the night, unaware of the deadly device ticking away in its basement. "I need to see the device directly," she said, her voice carrying the authority she'd developed during countless high-stakes operations. "Remote surveillance isn't sufficient for Hassan's work. He builds psychological elements into his devices that are designed to exploit the disarming process itself." Captain Blackwood nodded approvingly. "We have a fiber optic camera system that can provide direct visual access without triggering proximity sensors." As the team prepared for her approach to the school, Zoe felt her civilian anxieties being systematically replaced by military focus. The scared college student who had been discovered in her dorm room was transforming back into the confident EOD specialist who had successfully disarmed dozens of sophisticated explosive devices under enemy fire. But this transformation came with a cost she was only beginning to understand. Every step closer to the school building took her further from the peaceful existence she tried to build at Mountain View University. Every tactical decision she made reinforced her identity as a military operative rather than a mechanical engineering student. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Aria. "Watching the news. Be safe. We'll be here when you get back." The simple message carried more weight than any military commendation she had ever received, reminding her that the stakes of this operation went beyond immediate tactical success. "Agent Walsh," Zoe said as they approached the school perimeter, "I need you to understand something. I'm not doing this as a military operative following orders. I'm doing this as a human being who refuses to let children die because of one man's vendetta against people who served their country." Agent Walsh nodded slowly. "Understood, Sergeant. But I need you to understand something as well. Hassan has been planning this specific scenario for months, possibly years. Every aspect of this situation has been designed to force you into an impossible choice. The device, the timing, the media attention, the personal message, none of it is coincidental." The warning hung in the air as they reached the school's main entrance. Through the windows, Zoe could see empty hallways and darkened classrooms, the building evacuated hours ago when the device had first been discovered. But in the basement, she knew, lay a device that represented everything she'd tried to leave behind.
the deadly intersection of human ingenuity and malicious intent that had defined her military service. "Are you ready, Sergeant?" Captain Blackwood asked, his hand on the school's front door. Zoe took a deep breath, feeling the weight of her tactical gear, the expectations of the assembled law enforcement personnel, and the knowledge that 734 children's lives hung in the balance. "I'm ready. Let's go save some kids." But as they entered the school building, she couldn't shake the feeling that Hassan had anticipated even this moment, that her decision to help was simply another move in a game whose rules she still didn't fully understand.
The Jefferson Elementary School's basement felt like descending into a tomb. The usual sounds of institutional life, air conditioning, fluorescent lights, distant voices, had been replaced by an oppressive silence broken only by the soft clicking of the device's timer mechanism. Zoe followed Agent Walsh and Captain Blackwood down the narrow stairwell, her tactical gear feeling both foreign and familiar after 3 years of civilian clothes. "The device is in the main mechanical room," Agent Walsh explained, her voice barely above a whisper, despite the building's evacuation. Hassan gained access through the utility tunnels that connect to the city's storm drainage system. He had unrestricted time to construct and position the device exactly where he wanted it. As they approached the mechanical room, Zoe could hear the soft electronic beeping that had haunted her dreams for months after her final deployment. The sound triggered muscle memory she'd tried to suppress. The hypervigilance, the systematic visual scanning, the mental calculations of blast radius and structural damage that had kept her alive through dozens of similar scenarios. "Stop here," she said, raising her hand as they reached the doorway. "I need to assess the situation before anyone else gets closer." Through the fiber optic camera system, Zoe studied the device that Ahmed Hassan had spent months planning specifically for her. The configuration was immediately recognizable, a hybrid of military-grade C4 explosive with timer mechanisms and anti-tampering devices that bore Hassan's distinctive engineering signature. But there were modifications she'd never seen before, innovations that suggested he'd spent the 3 years since Afghanistan developing new methods specifically designed to counter American EOD procedures. "Jesus," she breathed, recognizing the psychological complexity of Hassan's design. "He's not just trying to kill children, he's trying to ensure that I die in the process." Captain Blackwood leaned closer to the monitor. "Explain." "See those secondary wires running from the primary timer to what looks like a communication array? That's not just a timer, it's a dead man switch connected to Hassan's remote location. If my heart rate stops transmitting, if I'm killed or incapacitated during the disarmament process, the device detonates immediately." Agent Walsh studied the display with growing alarm. "So he's watching this entire operation remotely?" "More than watching," Zoe replied, her voice carrying the grim certainty of someone who had studied Hassan's methods extensively during her military service. "He's participating. This device isn't just designed to explode. It's designed to force me into a conversation with him while I work. Those communication components aren't just monitoring equipment. They're two-way radio systems." As if responding to her observation, a speaker crackled to life within the mechanical room. Hassan's voice, speaking accented English, filled the basement with familiar menace. "Sergeant Isabella Nakamura Chen, the daughter of the bomb maker, finally returns to her true calling." His voice carried the same mix of intelligence and cruelty that had made him such an effective insurgent leader in Afghanistan. "I have been waiting 3 years to complete our conversation." Zoe felt her hands clench involuntarily. During her final deployment, she had tracked Hassan through 3 provinces, following the signature of his explosive devices and the pattern of their psychological complexity. She had never confronted him directly, but his work had killed or wounded 17 members of her unit, including Staff Sergeant Martinez, whose death had ultimately driven her decision to leave military service. "Hassan, you have 700 children in this building. Whatever vendetta you have against me doesn't justify threatening innocent lives."
Hassan's laughter echoed through the basement, a sound that carried memories of briefings where intelligence officers had played recordings of his voice for identification purposes. Innocent lives, like the children in the Kandahar market where your unit conducted operations, like the families in the villages your convoys destroyed while hunting for my associates. The accusation hit Zoe like a physical blow. The Kandahar market incident had been the defining trauma of her military service, an intelligence failure that had resulted in civilian casualties despite her unit's attempts to minimize collateral damage. She had spent 2 years in therapy trying to process the guilt of unintended consequences that seemed to follow military operations regardless of careful planning and ethical intentions. That was different, she said, though her voice lacked conviction. We were trying to prevent larger attacks. We were following intelligence that indicated nothing, Hassan interrupted. Your American military machine operates on assumptions and prejudices, destroying communities while claiming to protect them. Just as you destroyed my village, my family, my life's work in the name of your noble mission. Agent Walsh motioned for Zoe to continue the conversation while FBI technical specialists attempted to trace the signal. The psychological warfare was clearly Hassan's primary objective, with the explosive device serving as both threat and stage for a confrontation that had been years in the making.
I remember your village, Zoe said, her voice steadying as she accessed memories she'd tried to bury. I remember the workshop where you built the devices that killed my friends. I remember the intelligence reports that documented your training of insurgent bomb makers throughout the province. And I remember the daughter of the bomb maker, Hassan replied, his voice growing more personal, more intimate in its hostility. The American woman who thought she could master the art of destruction and then walk away to build pretty civilian bridges and peaceful college buildings. Did you think you could escape what you are? The phrase, daughter of the bomb maker, resonated with implications Zoe was only beginning to understand. Hassan hadn't just been tracking her military service. He'd been studying her personal history, her motivations for joining EOD, her relationship with explosive devices that went beyond simple technical competence. You studied my psychological profile, she realized. You know why I specialized in bomb disposal. Your father died in a construction accident when you were 12. An explosive charge used for demolition work detonated prematurely, killing him and 3 other workers. You joined the Marines to prevent such deaths, to master the technology that had taken your father's life. The revelation that Hassan had researched her personal background so thoroughly sent chills through the assembled law enforcement personnel. Agent Walsh exchanged worried glances with Captain Blackwood, both recognizing that this operation was far more complex than a simple terrorist attack. But you cannot master death, Isabella Nakamura-chan. You can only serve it or be consumed by it. For 3 years, you have tried to pretend otherwise, playing at being a normal student, a peaceful engineer, a woman who builds instead of destroys. But here you are, surrounded by your true family, soldiers and agents and weapons specialists who understand what you really are. Zoe looked around at the tactical team surrounding her, recognizing the truth in Hassan's observation. Despite 3 years of attempting to integrate into civilian academic life, she was most comfortable here, in a high-stakes military operation where her specialized knowledge made her indispensable rather than unusual. This device you've built, she said, refocusing on the immediate tactical situation, it's not just about revenge. You're trying to prove that people like me can never really leave this world. People like us, Hassan corrected. We are both artists of destruction, Isabella. The only difference is that I embrace what I am, while you pretend to be something else. Today, you will discover that the pretense has always been an illusion. The timer mechanism clicked more rapidly, indicating that the device had entered its final phase. Zoe realized that Hassan's psychological manipulation was designed to consume time as much as to inflict emotional damage. Every minute spent in conversation was a minute closer to detonation, but cutting off communication could trigger immediate explosion through the dead man's switch system. Agent Walsh, Zoe said, turning away from the monitoring equipment.
I need your team to clear the basement. This device is more complex than anything I've encountered, and Hassan's psychological games are designed to interfere with the disarmament process. We can't leave you alone down here, Agent Walsh protested. Protocol requires... Protocol is exactly what Hassan expects. He spent 3 years studying American EOD procedures and developing countermeasures. If I'm going to save those children, I need to approach this device in ways that don't match our standard training. Captain Blackwood nodded slowly, recognizing the tactical logic despite the obvious risks. Sergeant, you'll maintain radio contact throughout the procedure, any indication of problems, and we're coming down regardless of protocol. As the tactical team withdrew, leaving Zoe alone with Hassan's device and his disembodied voice, she felt the familiar calm that had carried her through her most dangerous operations. But she also felt something new, a clarity about her identity that transcended the artificial division between her military and civilian selves. She was neither just a college student nor just a bomb disposal expert. She was someone who had chosen to use her knowledge of destruction in service of protection, someone who understood destruction well enough to prevent it. The device clicked ominously as she knelt beside it, her hands moving toward wires that could save 700 children or kill them all, depending on decisions she would make in the next few minutes.
Alone in the mechanical room with Hassan's voice crackling through the speakers and 700 children's lives hanging in the balance, Zoe felt the weight of 3 years of suppressed identity crashing down around her. The device before her was a masterpiece of psychological warfare. Every wire, every component, every timing mechanism designed not just to kill, but to force her into a confrontation with everything she'd tried to leave behind. "You hesitate, daughter of the bomb maker." Hassan's voice carried a cruel satisfaction. "Even now, faced with innocent lives, you struggle between your true nature and your pretense of civilian morality." Zoe ignored the taunt, her trained eyes analyzing the device's configuration with the systematic precision that had kept her alive through countless similar scenarios. The primary explosive was military-grade C4, enough to bring down the entire school building and kill everyone inside. But the triggering mechanism was where Hassan's psychological artistry truly showed. Multiple redundant systems that seemed to offer several disarmament options while actually funneling her toward increasingly dangerous choices. "Agent Walsh, I need you to understand something. This device isn't designed to be disarmed. It's designed to force me to make a choice between my life and the children's lives." Agent Walsh's voice crackled back through the radio with barely controlled tension. "Explain, Sergeant." Hassan has created what we call a Morton's fork in EOD terminology, a situation where every available choice leads to the same negative outcome. Zoe traced the wiring with her finger, not yet touching, but mapping the electrical pathways. The primary explosive is military-grade C4, enough to bring down the entire school building and kill everyone inside. But the triggering mechanism is where Hassan's psychological artistry truly showed. Multiple redundant systems that seem to offer several disarmament options while actually funneling her toward increasingly dangerous choices. "That's not acceptable," Agent Walsh said finally. "There has to be another option." Hassan's laughter filled the basement, a sound that carried memories of intelligence briefings where analysts had played recordings of his voice for psychological profiling purposes. "Agent Walsh, your government trained Isabella to be the perfect weapon against people like me. But weapons, once used, are often destroyed in the process. That is the nature of war." "This isn't war," Zoe said, her voice steady despite the churning emotions. "This is murder disguised as ideology. All war is murder disguised as ideology. The only difference is which murder we choose to justify. You murdered my associates in Afghanistan while claiming to protect innocent civilians. I murder children in California while claiming to expose the violence inherent in your peaceful society. We are both killers who tell ourselves noble stories." Zoe felt the familiar rage that had driven her through her most dangerous operations in Afghanistan, not just anger at Hassan's cruelty, but fury at his ability to twist legitimate moral complexity into justification for unconscionable acts. She had joined the military specifically to prevent people like Hassan from harming innocent civilians,
but his psychological manipulation was designed to make her question whether her motivations had ever been as pure as she'd believed. The difference, Hassan, is that I'm trying to save lives while you're trying to destroy them. Are you? Hassan's voice carried a challenge that cut deeper than simple mockery. Tell me, Isabella, how many people died because of operations you participated in? How many villages were destroyed because your unit identified them as hostile? How many children lost parents because you were very good at finding and eliminating threats? The questions hit their intended targets with devastating precision. Zoe had spent years in therapy trying to process the moral complexity of military operations that had saved lives while simultaneously causing civilian casualties. The Kandahar market incident alone had resulted in 17 civilian deaths, despite her unit's attempts to minimize collateral damage. Those were unintended consequences of operations designed to prevent larger attacks, she said, but her voice carried less conviction than she'd hoped.
Unintended consequences, Hassan repeated. Such a convenient phrase for the deaths that follow American military intervention. But there is nothing unintended about this device, Isabella. Every component, every wire, every timer mechanism has been precisely calculated to achieve exactly the outcome I desire. Zoe forced herself to focus on the immediate tactical situation rather than Hassan's psychological attacks. The device's timer showed 18 minutes remaining, enough time for a careful disarmament attempt if she could identify a fourth option that Hassan hadn't anticipated. But her analysis kept returning to the same conclusion. Every system was designed to channel her toward the biometric scanner that would save the children while killing her. Hassan, you've spent 3 years planning this scenario, but you've made one crucial mistake. Enlighten me, daughter of the bomb maker. You've assumed that I'm still the same person who left Afghanistan 3 years ago. You've designed this device to exploit the psychology of Sergeant Isabella Nakamura Chen, but that person doesn't exist anymore. Hassan's silence suggested that her words had caught him off guard. The woman you're talking to isn't just a military EOD specialist. She's also a mechanical engineering student who spent 3 years learning about structural systems, electrical theory, and material science from a civilian perspective. She's someone who's learned that destruction and creation aren't opposites. They're different applications of the same technical knowledge. Agent Walsh's voice came through the radio with renewed hope. Sergeant, what are you thinking? I'm thinking that Hassan designed this device to counter military EOD procedures, but he didn't account for civilian engineering approaches. Zoe pulled a multimeter from her toolkit and began measuring electrical current flows through the device's various systems. Military disarmament focuses on interrupting the intended function of explosive devices, but civilian engineering focuses on understanding system failures and exploiting structural weaknesses. Hassan's voice carried new tension. Your academic games will not save those children, Isabella. Physics is physics. Explosives are explosives. The timer continues counting regardless of your theoretical knowledge. You're right about physics being physics, but you're wrong about the timer being inviolable. She traced a series of secondary wires that seemed to serve no obvious function in the device's primary operation. These redundant circuits aren't just backup systems. They're designed to prevent tampering with the main timer. But they're also potential failure points if someone approaches them from an electrical engineering perspective rather than a military one. Captain Blackwood's voice carried cautious optimism. Are you saying you can disarm the device without triggering the biometric scanner? I'm saying I can potentially cause a controlled failure in the timing system that will disable the device without detonation. Zoe's hands moved with increasing confidence as she identified connection points that Hassan probably considered secure. But it requires treating this as an electrical engineering problem rather than a military one. Hassan's voice rose with anger. You cannot escape what you are, Isabella. You are a killer, trained by killers to serve killers. Your academic pretenses change nothing. Maybe you're right, Zoe said, beginning to disconnect specific wires in a sequence that violated every standard EOD procedure she had ever learned. Maybe I am a killer. But I'm a killer who's learned to build things as well as destroy them. And right now, I'm going to build a future for 700 children that doesn't include your vendetta. The device's timer flickered as she completed the first phase of her impromptu disarmament procedure. Hassan's psychological manipulation had revealed his primary weakness. He had planned for the military specialist she'd been,
but not for the integrated person she'd become through 3 years of attempting to build a civilian identity. 12 minutes remaining, Agent Walsh reported through the radio. I know, Zoe replied, her hands steady as she approached the most dangerous phase of her unconventional disarmament attempt. Hassan, you wanted to prove that I could never escape my military identity? Instead, you're about to discover that my military identity was never separate from my civilian one. I've always been someone who uses technical knowledge to protect innocent people. The only difference is that now I have more technical knowledge. The devices clicked ominously as she prepared to cut the final wire, a decision that would either save 700 children or kill them all based on engineering principles Hassan never anticipated she would learn.
The wire cutters trembled in Zoe's hands for just a moment before her training reasserted itself. She had identified the critical junction where Hassan's military-grade design intersected with civilian electrical engineering principles, a vulnerability he couldn't have anticipated because he'd never considered that his target might have evolved beyond her original military specialization. Agent Walsh, I'm about to attempt the disarmament sequence, Zoe said into her radio, her voice carrying the calm authority that had earned her commendations during her most dangerous deployments. If this doesn't work, you will have approximately 30 seconds to clear the immediate blast radius. Sergeant, wait! Agent Walsh's voice crackled with tension. Are you certain about this approach? We could evacuate the surrounding blocks and contain the damage. 700 children, Agent Walsh. I didn't spend 3 years learning civilian engineering just to abandon those kids when that knowledge might save them. Hassan's voice filled the basement with renewed urgency. Isabella, you are making a fatal error. This device cannot be disarmed through your academic theories. You will trigger the anti-tampering systems and kill everyone you are trying to protect. Maybe, Zoe replied, positioning the wire cutters at the precise junction point she'd identified. But you made an error too, Hassan. You designed this device to counter the EOD specialist I was 3 years ago. You never considered who I might have become since then. The first cut severed the primary feedback loop that monitored the device's timing mechanism. Instead of the explosive detonation Hassan had engineered to punish any tampering attempt, the device emitted a soft electronic whine as its internal systems struggled to compensate for the unexpected circuit interruption. Impossible! Hassan's voice carried genuine shock, for the first time since the confrontation had begun. The anti-tampering protocols should have triggered immediate detonation. Military anti-tampering protocols, Zoe corrected, making her second cut at a connection point that existed purely to prevent civilian electrical interference. But I just treated your military device like a civilian electrical system with a malfunction. Instead of trying to interrupt your intended function, I created a controlled failure that mimics a natural system breakdown. The device's timer flickered and began displaying erratic numbers, not counting down to detonation, but cycling through random sequences as its programming struggled to interpret the engineered electrical failure. Captain Blackwood's voice carried cautious hope through the radio. Sergeant, what's the device's status? Entering controlled failure mode, Zoe replied, making her third and most crucial cut. Hassan designed this to be tamper-proof against military EOD procedures, but he didn't account for someone who understands both military explosives and civilian electrical engineering. I'm essentially convincing the device that it's experienced a natural malfunction rather than intentional interference. The device's display go dark, the electronic beeping stopped, the mechanical clicking that had provided a countdown to catastrophe ceased entirely. Agent Walsh's voice crackled through the radio with barely contained relief. Sergeant, are you showing a successful disarmament? Device is neutralized, though I maintain my position near the explosive components. But Hassan's communication system is still active. He may have backup plans. Hassan's voice, when it came through the speakers, carried a tone Zoe had never heard from him during their years of indirect confrontation in Afghanistan, something that might have been respect mixed with his usual malice. You have surprised me, daughter of the bomb maker. I spent 3 years researching your psychological profile, your military service record, your attempt to escape into civilian academia. But I underestimated your capacity for growth.
People change, Hassan. The person who's responsible for those deaths in Afghanistan learned from those experiences. She didn't just run away from military service. She integrated that knowledge with civilian education to become someone who could protect people more effectively. And yet, you still serve the same system that destroyed my village, my family, my life's work, Hassan replied, though his voice lacked its earlier conviction. Your government will use your success here to justify future operations that will create more people like me. Zoe felt the weight of that truth even as she celebrated the successful disarmament. The cycle of violence that had created Hassan wouldn't end simply because she'd prevented this particular attack. But she had learned something during her 3 years at Mountain View University that her military training had never taught her. That individual acts of protection and construction could exist within larger systems of conflict without being negated by those systems.
Maybe you're right about the larger cycle, she said, beginning to pack up her equipment as FBI technical specialists prepared to secure the neutralized device. But 700 children are going to go home to their families tonight because I chose to use my knowledge to protect them rather than to perpetuate violence. That matters, even if it doesn't solve everything. Hassan's voice carried a note of finality. This is not over, Isabella. I have spent years preparing for this confrontation, and your academic cleverness has merely delayed the inevitable reckoning. Hassan, Zoe said, standing and facing the communication equipment directly, the reckoning you're talking about already happened. It happened when I decided that my military expertise could serve life instead of just death. It happened when I chose to learn civilian applications for technical knowledge. It happened when I discovered that courage doesn't require perpetual conflict. The communication system crackled with static, then went silent. FBI technical specialists immediately began attempting to trace Hassan's transmission source, but Zoe suspected he had planned for this contingency and was already beyond their reach. Agent Walsh descended into the basement with a team of explosive ordnance specialists, her face mixing relief with professional concern. Sergeant Nakamura, that was either the most brilliant EOD work I've ever witnessed or the most dangerous improvisation in federal law enforcement history. Probably both, Zoe admitted, accepting the congratulations of the specialist team while maintaining her focus on potential remaining threats. Hassan is still out there, and this attack was part of a larger pattern targeting former EOD specialist who's transitioned to civilian life. Captain Blackwood joined them in the basement, his expression carrying the satisfaction of a successful mission, tempered by awareness of ongoing threats. Sergeant, the Pentagon is going to want a comprehensive debrief on your disarmament procedures. If Hassan is targeting other specialists with similar devices, we need to understand your countermeasures. I'll provide whatever technical information will help protect other veterans, Zoe replied, though she felt a familiar wariness about military bureaucracy and institutional appropriation of individual innovations. But I need to understand something first. What happens to my civilian life after tonight? Agent Walsh and Captain Blackwood exchanged glances that suggested this question had been anticipated, but not fully resolved. Honestly, Sergeant, that's going to depend largely on you. The media coverage of this incident is going to make your military background public knowledge. Your university, your classmates, your professors, everyone is going to know who you really are and what you're capable of. The reality of her situation settled over Zoe like the weight of her tactical gear. 3 years of carefully constructed anonymity had been destroyed in a single night, not through her own choice, but through Hassan's manipulation of circumstances beyond her control. But, Captain Blackwood added, what happened here tonight proves something important. Your attempt to integrate military expertise with civilian education wasn't an escape from your service identity, it was an evolution of it. You didn't become less effective as a protector by learning civilian skills, you became more effective. As they prepared to leave the basement, Zoe's phone buzzed with messages from her Mountain View University floormates. Aria had sent a simple text, "Watching the news, you saved those kids, we're proud of you." Blake had forwarded news articles with headlines like, "Former Marine uses college engineering knowledge to thwart terror attack." Even Ethan, usually the most reserved of their study group, had sent a message. "Now I understand why you were so good at applied thermodynamics."
The messages carried a recognition that surprised her, not judgment or fear about her concealed military background, but acceptance of the integrated person she had become through combining her service experience with civilian education. "Agent Walsh," Zoe said as they climbed the stairs toward the school's main floor, "I have a request. I want to return to Mountain View University tomorrow. I have finals to take, and I owe my floormates an explanation about who I really am." Agent Walsh nodded slowly. "I think that can be arranged, Sergeant. But first, we need to address the immediate security concerns. Hassan is still active, and he may view tonight's failure as a reason to escalate his campaign against former EOD specialists." As they emerged from Jefferson Elementary School into the California night, Zoe saw news crews, federal agents, and local law enforcement personnel who had spent hours preparing for a potential catastrophe that had been prevented through an approach none of them had anticipated. But more importantly, she saw a future where her military service and civilian education weren't competing identities, but complementary aspects of a person who had learned to protect others through multiple forms of expertise. The scared college student who had been discovered in her dorm room no longer existed. Neither did the compartmentalized military specialist who had left Afghanistan 3 years ago. In their place stood someone new, a person who could save children's lives precisely because she had learned to integrate all aspects of her knowledge and experience in service of protecting others.
The Mountain View University campus looked surreal under the glare of national news cameras as Zoe's helicopter touched down on the athletics field at dawn. What should have been a quiet morning of final exam preparation had transformed into a media circus that fundamentally altered the character of the small California university, a world that no longer recognized the careful anonymity she'd maintained for 3 years. Dean Patricia Lawson waited at the landing zone with a mixture of administrative anxiety and genuine concern etched across her usually composed features. Behind her stood Professor Winters, whose presence felt like an anchor of normalcy in the chaos that had erupted around Zoe's revealed identity. The morning sun cast long shadows across the quad, highlighting the surreal juxtaposition of military operations and academic routine. "Ms. Nakamura," Dean Lawson began, then caught herself. "Sergeant Nakamura Chen, I'm not entirely sure how to address you anymore." "Zoe is fine," she replied, accepting her duffel bag from Captain Blackwood. "The person who's been taking your mechanical engineering courses for 3 years is the same person who disarmed that device last night. The only difference is that now everyone knows about both sides of my background." Professor Winters stepped forward, her academic composure unable to completely mask her emotional investment in one of her most dedicated students. "Zoe, the entire engineering department has been watching the news coverage. What you accomplished last night, integrating civilian engineering principles with military expertise, that's exactly the kind of innovative problem-solving we tried to teach here." The validation from her favorite instructor carried more weight than Zoe had expected. For 3 years, she'd worried that revealing her military background would create distance between her and the civilian academic world she'd tried to join. But Professor Winters' response suggested that her education had been valued for itself, not dismissed once her previous experience became known. "There's something else," Dean Lawson continued, producing a folder thick with official documents. "The Department of Defense has been in contact with the university administration throughout the night. They're requesting permission to establish a joint civilian-military engineering program here at Mountain View, with you as the primary developer and instructor." Zoe felt her stomach tighten with familiar wariness about institutional appropriation of individual achievements. "Dean Lawson, I haven't even finished my own degree yet. I still have finals to take this week." "About that," Professor Winters interjected with something that looked suspiciously like pride, "the engineering faculty held an emergency meeting this morning. Given your demonstrated mastery of advanced engineering principles under extreme conditions, we're recommending that you be allowed to graduate with honors based on your practical application of theoretical knowledge." The validation from her favorite instructor carried more weight than Zoe had expected. For 3 years, she'd worried that revealing her military background would create distance between her and the civilian academic world she'd tried to join.
But Professor Winter's response suggested that her education had been valued for itself, not dismissed once her previous experience became known. "There's something else," Dean Lawson continued, producing a folder thick with official documents. "The Department of Defense has been in contact with the university administration throughout the night. They're requesting permission to establish a joint civilian-military engineering program here at Mountain View, with you as the primary developer and instructor." Captain Blackwood cleared his throat, drawing attention to the federal agents who were preparing to depart. "Sergeant, before we leave, there's something you should know. The FBI traced Hassan's communication signal to a location in Mexico, but by the time tactical teams arrived, he had already evacuated. He left behind documents that suggest this attack was part of a larger operation targeting former EOD specialists across multiple states." The news that Hassan remained at large sent a chill through Zoe's sense of accomplished relief. The successful disarmament had saved 700 children, but it hadn't eliminated the threat to other veterans who were trying to build civilian lives. "How many other targets?" she asked. "At least 12 former EOD specialists who've transitioned to civilian careers in engineering, education, or technical fields," Agent Walsh replied, joining the conversation as her team prepared their own departure. "Hassan has been conducting surveillance on all of them, apparently planning a coordinated campaign to force them back into military roles or destroy them psychologically." The scope of Hassan's vendetta made Zoe realize that her own experience was part of a systematic attack on the concept of successful military-to-civilian transitions. Hassan wasn't just targeting individuals, he was targeting the possibility that people who had served in combat roles could find peaceful, productive lives afterward.
Agent Walsh, I want to help protect those other veterans, Zoe said, her voice carrying the authority she'd developed during her most dangerous deployments. If Hassan is using psychological profiles to exploit their attempts at civilian integration, then someone who successfully defended against those tactics might be able to help them prepare. The Pentagon has already considered that possibility, Captain Blackwood replied. They're prepared to offer you a consulting position that would allow you to complete your degree while developing countermeasures for Hassan's psychological warfare techniques. Dean Lawson looked between the federal agents and her student with the expression of someone trying to balance institutional interests with individual welfare. "Zoe, the university would support whatever decision you make, but I want you to understand that you have options here. The joint program the Department of Defense has proposed would give you significant autonomy while providing resources for research that could help other veterans." As the federal agents departed, leaving Zoe alone with university administrators who were still processing the revelation of her true background, she felt the weight of decisions that would determine not just her future, but potentially the futures of other veterans facing similar psychological attacks. Her phone buzzed with messages from her floormates, who had apparently been watching the news coverage while preparing for their own final exams. Aria had sent a group text. "We're all in Blake's room watching CNN. You're famous. Also, we saved your spot for the organic chemistry final tomorrow if you still want to take it." The casual tone of the message, treating her the same person they'd known despite the dramatic revelation of her military background, provided an emotional anchor that federal recognition and institutional offers couldn't match. Her floormates represented the civilian connections she'd spent 3 years building, relationships that weren't based on her military expertise, but on shared academic struggles, late-night conversations, and mutual support through the challenges of college life. "Dean Lawson," Zoe said, making a decision that surprised even her, "I want to take my finals this week. All of them. I want to earn my degree the same way every other student here earns theirs." Professor Winters smiled with the satisfaction of an educator who had recognized something important about learning and achievement. "Zoe, you've already demonstrated mastery far beyond what our final exams could measure, but I think I understand why you want to complete them anyway. Because finishing what I started here isn't just about the degree. It's about proving, to myself as much as anyone else, that my military experience and civilian education aren't competing identities. They're integrated parts of who I've become." Dean Lawson nodded slowly,
her administrative concerns giving way to recognition of something more fundamental about education and personal development. Very well. You'll take your scheduled finals, and the Department of Defense consultation can wait until after graduation. The joint program proposal will be here when you're ready to consider it. As Zoe walked across the campus quad toward Riverside Hall, she could feel the stares of fellow students who were seeing her with completely new understanding. But rather than the judgment or alienation she'd feared, most faces showed curiosity mixed with something that looked like respect. The scared college student who'd hidden her military background was gone, replaced by someone who could acknowledge all aspects of her experience without shame or apology. Professor Winters fell into step beside her as they approached a dormitory. "Zoe, I have a question that's been bothering me since last night. Why did you really come to Mountain View? Was it just to hide from your military past, or was there something else you were looking for?" The question touched something Zoe hadn't fully articulated, even to herself during 3 years of careful civilian integration. "I came here because I wanted to learn how to build things instead of just preventing their destruction. But I think what I actually learned was how to build a life that integrated all of my experiences instead of compartmentalizing them." They entered Riverside Hall to find Zoe's floormates gathered in the common area, their textbooks and study materials spread across tables in preparation for finals week. The sight of normal college life continuing despite the dramatic events of the previous night felt like a gift, proof that the peaceful existence she'd tried to create hadn't been destroyed by Hassan's psychological warfare.
Blake looked up from his computer science notes with a grin that mixed excitement with genuine affection. "So, roommate, turns out you're a lot more interesting than you let on. Think you can help me with my materials engineering final? I'm guessing you know more about stress analysis than our textbooks cover." Aria emerged from their shared room with organic chemistry flashcards and an expression that suggested she'd spent the night processing the revelation about her roommate's background. "Zoe, I have about 1,000 questions about everything that happened last night. But first, are you okay? I mean, really okay?" The question carried the kind of personal concern that reminded Zoe why she'd valued these relationships so highly. Her floormates weren't asking about her tactical innovations or her federal commendations. They were asking about her well-being as a person they cared about. "I'm okay," she said, settling into her familiar spot on the common room couch. "Actually, I'm better than okay. For the first time in 3 years, I don't have to pretend to be someone else. You know who I really am now, and you're still here." Ethan looked up from his advanced physics textbook with the expression of someone who had been reconsidering every academic interaction they'd shared. "Zoe, I keep thinking about all those times you helped me with thermodynamics problems. Were you just pretending to find them difficult?" "I was finding them difficult, but for different reasons than you were. I understood the physics, but I was learning to apply that knowledge in peaceful contexts instead of combat situations. That's actually much harder than it sounds." The conversation continued as her floormates processed the integration of the person they'd known with the military specialist they'd discovered. But what struck Zoe most was that the fundamental dynamic of their relationships hadn't changed. They still treated her as someone they cared about, someone whose opinion they valued, someone who belonged in their civilian academic community. As evening approached and they began preparing for the next day's final examinations, Zoe realized that Hassan's psychological attack had failed in its primary objective. He had intended to force her to choose between her military identity and her civilian aspirations, to prove that successful transitions from combat service to peaceful life were impossible. Instead, she had discovered that the integration of military expertise with civilian education made her more effective at protecting others, not less. Her 3 years at Mountain View University hadn't been an escape from her service identity, they had been the completion of it.
3 weeks after the Jefferson Elementary incident, Zoe stood before a classroom filled with federal agents, military personnel, and civilian educators who had gathered at Mountain View University for the first session of what the Department of Defense had officially designated the Integrated Crisis Response Training Program. The makeshift lecture hall buzzed with the kind of energy that accompanied unprecedented institutional experiments. Equal parts excitement and skepticism from people who weren't entirely sure what they were witnessing. Ladies and gentlemen, she began, her voice carrying the confidence she developed through successfully completing her final exams while simultaneously consulting on federal counterterrorism protocols. Everything you think you know about crisis response is probably correct within its specific context. Military approaches work in military contexts. Civilian approaches work in civilian contexts. But threats like Ahmad Hassan operate at the intersection of both worlds, which means our responses need to do the same. In the audience, Master Sergeant Kane took notes alongside Dr. Vincent Gray, the university's head of mechanical engineering. FBI agent Walsh sat next to Professor Winters, their collaboration representing the kind of institutional boundary crossing that would have been unthinkable before Hassan's attack had demonstrated the limitations of compartmentalized expertise. The device I disarmed 3 weeks ago wasn't defeated through superior military tactics or advanced civilian technology, Zoe continued, clicking to her first slide, which showed the technical specifications of Hassan's bomb alongside her unconventional disarmament approach. It was defeated because I was able to integrate knowledge from both domains in ways that Hassan hadn't anticipated. Captain Blackwood raised his hand from the back row. Sergeant, how do we systemize that kind of integration? How do we train people to think beyond their primary specialization without diluting their core expertise? The question struck at the heart of what Zoe had been grappling with since accepting the joint position that allowed her to complete her degree while developing new training protocols. Captain, that's exactly the wrong question. We're not trying to create generalists who know a little about everything. We're trying to create specialists who understand how their expertise connects to other fields. She clicked to her next slide, showing a network diagram that mapped the relationships between military EOD procedures, civilian electrical engineering, structural analysis, and psychology. When I was working on Hassan's device, I wasn't abandoning my military training to apply civilian knowledge. I was using civilian engineering principles to enhance my military expertise. The integration made both skill sets more effective. Blake Morrison, who had been attending the sessions as part of his advanced studies program, raised his hand tentatively. Dr. Nakamura Chen. He caught himself, still adjusting to the formal title that had accompanied her rapid completion of graduate requirements. Blake, the answer is that you don't know until you need them. When I was learning thermodynamics and material science, I thought I was preparing for a career designing peaceful infrastructure. I had no idea that understanding heat transfer and material stress analysis would be crucial for disarming sophisticated explosive devices. Dr. Gray leaned forward with the expression of someone who had spent decades thinking about educational theory and practical application. What you're describing sounds like liberal arts education applied to technical fields. The idea that broad knowledge creates unexpected connections that enhance specialized expertise. Exactly, but with a crucial difference. Traditional liberal arts education assumes that broad knowledge is valuable in the abstract. What we're developing here is integration training that helps specialists understand how their expertise connects to specific other fields that are likely to be relevant in crisis situations. FBI agent Walsh raised her hand with a question that carried the weight of practical law enforcement. Dr. Nakamura Chen, this approach worked brilliantly in your specific situation, but how do we know it will scale? Hassan's psychological profile was unique. His technical methods were sophisticated but idiosyncratic. What about more conventional threats? The question touched on Zoe's deepest concerns about the program she was developing. Hassan had been an unusually sophisticated adversary whose psychological warfare tactics had created a crisis specifically designed to exploit the intersection of military and civilian expertise. Most terrorist threats operated within more conventional parameters that didn't require such complex responses.
Agent Walsh, you're right that Hassan represents an extreme case, Zoe acknowledged, but he also represents a trend. Modern threats increasingly operate across traditional boundaries. Cyber attacks that target both military and civilian infrastructure, terrorist tactics that exploit social media and psychological manipulation, environmental disasters that require both technical expertise and community coordination. She clicked to a slide showing recent crisis scenarios that had required multi-domain responses.
The COVID-19 pandemic required medical expertise, logistics coordination, economic analysis, and social psychology. Climate change responses need environmental science, engineering, policy analysis, and community organization. Even conventional terrorist attacks now involve social media management, psychological support, and economic impact analysis alongside traditional law enforcement and military responses. Professor Winters spoke from her position near the front row, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent decades watching educational innovations succeed and fail. What Zoe is describing isn't just crisis response training. It's a fundamental shift in how we think about expertise in an interconnected world. The observation sparked a murmur of conversation among the assembled participants, who were beginning to understand that the program they were evaluating had implications far beyond counterterrorism applications. Ethan Cross, another of Zoe's former floormates, who had been accepted into the program's pilot phase, raised his hand with the enthusiasm of someone who had discovered unexpected connections between his academic interests and real-world applications. Dr. Nakamura-Chen, I've been thinking about how this approach might apply to disaster response. After studying your disarmament techniques, I started researching how structural engineering principles might enhance search and rescue operations. What did you discover? Zoe asked, genuinely curious about how her former study partner was applying integration concepts to his own field. That most search and rescue teams have excellent tactical training but limited understanding of how building collapses create specific patterns of survivable spaces, Ethan replied with growing excitement. If rescue specialists learned basic structural engineering, they could identify survivor locations more efficiently and safely. The comment generated enthusiastic discussion among the assembled participants, who were beginning to see applications for integration training in their own fields. Military personnel suggested connections between civilian logistics and combat operations. FBI agents identified ways that academic social science research could enhance investigation techniques. University professors recognized opportunities to make their theoretical knowledge more practically applicable. Captain Blackwood stood to address the group, his expression carrying the satisfaction of someone who had recognized an important innovation. What we're witnessing here is the development of a new model for professional education. Instead of training people in isolated specializations, we're learning to train them in connected expertise that can adapt to unprecedented challenges. As the session continued, Zoe felt a profound satisfaction that went beyond professional accomplishment. The scared college student who had hidden her military background was gone, replaced by someone who could use all aspects of her experience to help others develop their own integrated capabilities. But more importantly, she was watching her former floormates and university classmates discover connections between their academic knowledge and real-world crisis response that they had never imagined possible. Blake was applying computer science principles to cybersecurity. Aria was exploring how chemistry knowledge could enhance hazardous materials response. Even Professor Winters was researching how mechanical engineering education could be adapted to include emergency applications. After the session ended, as participants gathered in small groups to continue their discussions, Zoe found herself standing with Agent Walsh and Captain Blackwood, reviewing feedback forms and planning future training modules. Dr. Nakamura-Chen, Agent Walsh said, I want you to know that the FBI has received requests from 12 other field offices to implement versions of this training program. The success you've demonstrated here is generating interest far beyond our original counterterrorism applications. Captain Blackwood nodded his agreement. The Pentagon is also receiving inquiries from NATO allies who are interested in developing their own integration training programs. What started as a response to one individual threat is becoming a new model for crisis preparedness. The recognition felt gratifying, but Zoe found herself most satisfied by a different kind of success. The transformation she was witnessing in people who had discovered that their existing expertise could be enhanced rather than threatened by learning how it connected to other fields.
Agent Walsh, Captain Blackwood, she said, looking around at the small groups of participants who were continuing their conversations despite the official end of the session. I think what we're really developing here isn't just crisis response training. We're developing a model for how people can contribute to solutions for complex problems without abandoning their specialized expertise. As she gathered her materials and prepared to return to her small campus office, a space that had been converted from a storage room to accommodate her unique position between academic and federal responsibilities, Zoe reflected on how dramatically her life had changed since that night when Navy SEALs had fast-roped into her quiet existence. The transformation hadn't been the destruction of her civilian identity that Hassan had intended. Instead, it had been the integration of all aspects of her experience into something more effective and more satisfying than either her purely military or purely civilian identities had ever been. Her phone buzzed with a message from Aria. "Just finished my first session with the FBI hazmat team. Thanks for helping me see how my chemistry knowledge could save lives instead of just passing tests. Dinner tomorrow to celebrate your first month as a professor, consultant, hero person?" Zoe smiled as she typed her response. "Just Zoe is fine. And yes, dinner sounds perfect."
6 months after Hassan's attack, the Mountain View University campus had transformed into something unprecedented in American higher education, a testing ground for integration training that attracted visitors from federal agencies, international governments, and academic institutions worldwide. Zoe stood in her expanded office, now occupying an entire floor of the engineering building, reviewing applications from veterans who wanted to participate in what the media had dubbed the Nakamura program. The stack of files represented more than career transitions. Each application told a story of military service members seeking to integrate their specialized knowledge with civilian expertise in ways that could serve their communities. Former combat medics wanted to combine their field experience with civilian emergency medicine. Military intelligence specialists sought to apply their analytical skills to academic research. EOD technicians like herself hoped to use their technical knowledge in civilian safety applications. "Dr. Nakamura-chen," came a voice from her office doorway. She turned to see Maria Santos, a former Army helicopter pilot who had completed the program's first intensive session and was now developing aviation safety protocols for civilian disaster response. "I wanted to update you on the California wildfire project." Maria entered with a tablet displaying aerial footage that would have looked chaotic to civilian observers, but told a clear story to someone trained in military reconnaissance. "Using the integration approach you taught us, my team combined military aviation tactics with civilian firefighting logistics. We reduced response times by 40% and increased suppression effectiveness by 60%. The success statistics were gratifying, but what struck Zoe more was the confidence in Maria's voice, the same transformation she'd witnessed in dozens of program participants who had discovered that their military expertise could enhance, rather than complicate, their civilian aspirations. "Dr. Nakamura-chen, that's exactly what this program was designed to achieve. You didn't abandon your military aviation knowledge to become a civilian pilot. You enhanced it with civilian applications that made you more effective at protecting communities." Through her office window, Zoe could see the program's latest cohort conducting practical exercises on the quad. Former Navy SEALs worked alongside social workers to develop community crisis response protocols. Military engineers collaborated with urban planners to design disaster-resistant infrastructure. The site represented everything she had hoped to accomplish when she'd first agreed to develop integration training methods. Professor Winters knocked on the doorframe before entering with her characteristic blend of academic formality and personal warmth. "Zoe, I have news that I think you'll find interesting. The National Science Foundation has approved funding for a comprehensive study of integration training outcomes. They want to document whether this approach produces measurably better results than traditional specialized training."
The prospect of formal academic validation felt both exciting and slightly intimidating. Zoe had developed her integration methods through practical necessity and intuitive understanding of how different fields of knowledge could connect. Subjecting those methods to rigorous academic scrutiny would either validate her approach or reveal flaws she hadn't considered. Professor Winters, I have to admit that the idea of formal evaluation makes me nervous. What if the academic research shows that integration training is just lucky improvisation rather than systematic innovation? Professor Winters settled into the chair across from Zoe's desk with the expression of someone who had spent decades watching students navigate the intersection of practical success and academic validation. Zoe, do you remember what you told me 6 months ago about why you wanted to complete your finals rather than accepting early graduation? Because I wanted to prove that my military experience and civilian education were integrated parts of who I'd become rather than competing identities, Zoe replied, recognizing the parallel her mentor was drawing. This is the same principle applied to your professional work. The NSF study isn't going to prove or disprove the value of what you've accomplished. It's going to document how integration training works so that others can replicate and improve upon your methods. The conversation was interrupted by Zoe's secure phone buzzing with an encrypted message from Agent Walsh. Hassan has been located in Venezuela. Venezuelan authorities are cooperating with extradition proceedings. Estimated timeline for his return to U.S. custody is 3 to 4 weeks. The news that Hassan would finally face justice for his attacks felt like the closing of a chapter that had defined Zoe's life for the past 6 months. But it also raised questions about what would happen to her work once the immediate threat that had created it was resolved.
Blake Morrison appeared in her doorway, now wearing the credentials of a cybersecurity specialist who had successfully applied integration training to develop new approaches for protecting civilian infrastructure from cyber warfare. Zoe, I wanted to give you an update on the power grid project. He entered with the enthusiasm of someone who had discovered that his academic computer science knowledge could be enhanced by military-style threat assessment techniques. Using the methods you taught us about connecting civilian and military expertise, my team identified vulnerabilities that neither traditional cybersecurity nor military intelligence would have found independently. Blake, explain what you mean. Civilian cybersecurity focuses on protecting against known attack patterns and technical vulnerabilities. Military intelligence focuses on anticipating enemy tactics and strategic objectives. But by combining both approaches, we discovered that the most dangerous threats exploit the gaps between civilian and military protection systems. The observation represented exactly what Zoe had hoped integration training would achieve, not the replacement of specialized expertise with generalized knowledge, but the connection of different specializations in ways that revealed previously invisible problems and solutions. Aria Valdez joined them, carrying a folder of documents from her work with the FBI's Hazardous Materials Response Team. Zoe, I wanted to update you on something concerning. The FBI has identified 3 other individuals who appear to be using Hassan's psychological warfare tactics to target veterans in civilian careers. The news that Hassan's approach was being replicated by other adversaries felt like validation of the integration training program's importance, but it also represented an escalation of the threat that had originally brought Zoe back into federal service. Aria, what kind of psychological tactics? Similar to what Hassan used against you, forcing veterans to choose between their civilian identities and their military expertise by creating crisis situations that require both. But these new individuals aren't as sophisticated as Hassan. They're using cruder methods that are easier to counter if people know what to look for. Agent Walsh appeared in the doorway as if summoned by their conversation. Dr. Nakamura-Chen, I apologize for arriving unannounced, but we have a situation that requires immediate consultation. She entered with the bearing of someone who had grown comfortable working within academic settings, despite her federal law enforcement background.
We've received intelligence that suggests one of Hassan's followers is planning an attack specifically designed to target integration training programs. The threat assessment indicates that this individual views your work as a direct challenge to their ideological objectives. The news that her program had become a target felt both frightening and oddly validating. If adversaries were specifically opposing integration training, it suggested that the approach was effective enough to threaten their psychological warfare strategies. Agent Walsh, what kind of attack are we talking about? Similar to Hassan's approach, but with a different objective. Instead of forcing individual veterans to choose between military and civilian identities, this individual wants to prove that integration training creates dangerous vulnerabilities by making people overconfident in their abilities. Professor Winters leaned forward with the expression of someone who had recognized the academic implications of the threat. They're trying to discredit the entire concept of interdisciplinary expertise by engineering failures that can be attributed to overreach beyond specialized competence. The psychological sophistication of the threat impressed Zoe, despite her concern for the program's participants and the communities they served. Agent Walsh, how do we protect against an adversary who's specifically trying to exploit the integration training approach? By doing exactly what you did with Hassan's device, using the integration approach in ways the adversary hasn't anticipated, Agent Walsh replied. We need to develop countermeasures that combine federal law enforcement, academic research, military intelligence, and civilian community protection in ways that create unexpected advantages.
Captain Blackwood's voice crackled through Agent Walsh's radio with an update that added urgency to their discussion. Agent Walsh, we have confirmation that the target is the upcoming integration training conference scheduled for next week. Estimated attendance includes over 200 participants from federal agencies, international governments, and academic institutions. The conference represented the culmination of 6 months of program development, an opportunity to demonstrate that integration training could be scaled and replicated across different institutions and applications. It also represented the highest profile gathering of people who had embraced Zoe's approach to connecting military and civilian expertise. Agent Walsh, Zoe said, feeling the familiar calm that had carried her through the most dangerous operations of her military service, I think we need to turn this threat into an opportunity. Explain. If someone is planning to attack the integration training conference to prove that our approach creates dangerous vulnerabilities, then we need to use the conference to demonstrate that integration training actually enhances security rather than compromising it. Blake looked up from his laptop where he'd been reviewing cybersecurity protocols for the conference venue. Zoe, what are you thinking? I'm thinking that we use the conference as a live demonstration of integration training principles. Instead of just talking about how military expertise can enhance civilian capabilities, we show how integrated approaches can counter sophisticated threats in real time. The proposal represented everything Zoe had learned about turning adversarial challenges into opportunities for demonstrating the effectiveness of integration training. Hassan had intended his psychological warfare to prove that veterans couldn't successfully transition to civilian life. Instead, his attack had created the circumstances that allowed Zoe to develop and demonstrate integration training methods. Now another adversary was planning to prove that integration training created dangerous overconfidence. Zoe was beginning to understand that the most effective response would be to use the threat itself as an opportunity to demonstrate that integration training actually enhanced, rather than compromised, security and effectiveness. Agent Walsh studied Zoe with the expression of someone who had learned to recognize innovative tactical thinking. Dr. Nakamura-Chen, are you proposing that we use the integration training conference as a controlled environment for demonstrating defensive capabilities against sophisticated psychological warfare? I'm proposing that we turn the conference into a live exercise where participants use integration training principles to protect themselves and each other against the kind of threats that are specifically designed to exploit interdisciplinary approaches. Professor Winters smiled with the satisfaction of an educator who had watched a student develop beyond their original instruction. Zoe, what you're describing isn't just crisis response or even training development. You're creating a new model for how communities can protect themselves by connecting different types of expertise in ways that create unexpected resilience.
As they began planning the conference transformation that would turn a potential target into a demonstration of integration training effectiveness, Zoe realized that her work had evolved far beyond responding to Hassan's individual threat. She was developing approaches that could help communities and institutions address a wide range of complex challenges by connecting rather than compartmentalizing different forms of expertise. The scared college student who had hidden her military background was gone. The isolated EOD specialist who had left Afghanistan was gone. In their place stood someone who had learned to build bridges between different worlds of knowledge and experience, bridges that made everyone more capable of protecting and serving others.
1 year after Hassan's attack, Zoe stood before the largest gathering of integration training participants in the program's history. The Mountain View University auditorium buzzed with conversations in multiple languages as federal agents, military personnel, academic researchers, and community leaders from 17 countries shared experiences and innovations that had emerged from connecting civilian and military expertise. The Integration Training Conference had evolved far beyond its original counterterrorism applications. In the front row sat Dr. Sarah Kim, a former Army medic who had revolutionized rural health care by combining field medicine with civilian community health approaches. Behind her, Captain James Mueller discussed with a Japanese disaster response official how military logistics could enhance civilian earthquake preparedness. The diversity of applications represented everything Zoe had hoped to achieve when she'd first proposed that specialized knowledge became more powerful through integration rather than isolation. "Ladies and gentlemen," Zoe began, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who had learned to embrace rather than hide the complexity of her identity. "When Navy SEALs fast-roped into my dorm room 18 months ago, I thought my carefully constructed civilian life was over. I thought I would have to choose between my military expertise and my academic aspirations." She clicked to her first slide, showing a photograph of Riverside Hall on that chaotic night when federal agents had discovered her concealed military background. What I discovered instead was that the choice itself was false. My military experience didn't compete with my civilian education, it enhanced it. My academic knowledge didn't diminish my tactical capabilities, it expanded them. Agent Walsh, now serving as the FBI's primary liaison for integration training programs, nodded approvingly from her position near the stage. The successful conclusion of Hassan's case, his conviction and sentencing to life in federal prison, had validated the effectiveness of integration approaches to complex security threats. But more importantly, it had demonstrated that psychological warfare tactics designed to exploit identity conflicts could be countered by people who had learned to integrate rather than compartmentalize different aspects of their experience. The program we've developed here represents more than crisis response training. It represents a fundamental shift in how we think about expertise in an interconnected world. Instead of building higher walls between different fields of knowledge, we're learning to build stronger bridges. Blake Morrison, now directing cybersecurity research for a major technology company, raised his hand from the audience. Despite his professional success, he maintained the enthusiastic curiosity that had made him such an effective study partner during their undergraduate years. "Dr. Nakamura-chan, I've been applying integration principles to artificial intelligence research. We're discovering that AI systems become more robust when they're trained on diverse data sets that cross traditional disciplinary boundaries. Are you seeing similar patterns in human training applications?" The question represented exactly the kind of innovative thinking that integration training was designed to foster. "Blake, that's a perfect example of how integration principles apply beyond crisis response. Whether we're talking about human expertise or artificial intelligence, diverse knowledge sources create unexpected capabilities that wouldn't emerge from isolated specializations." Professor Winters stood to address the conference from her position as the university's new Director of Interdisciplinary Studies, a position created specifically to support the expansion of integration training principles beyond military-civilian applications. What we're witnessing here is the emergence of a new educational paradigm. Instead of training people to think within disciplinary silos,
We're learning to train them to think across boundaries while maintaining the rigor of specialized expertise. Aria Valdez approached the microphone that had been set up for audience questions, wearing the credentials of a hazardous materials specialist who had successfully integrated chemistry knowledge with federal law enforcement techniques. Zoe, I wanted to update everyone on the community resilience project we discussed last year. She addressed the international audience with the confidence of someone who had learned to value her expertise without hiding behind it. Using integration training principles, our team developed emergency response protocols that combine civilian first aid, military triage procedures, and community organization methods. When Hurricane Patricia hit the Gulf Coast last month, communities trained in our integrated approach showed 60% better survival rates and 40% faster recovery times compared to areas using traditional emergency response methods.
The success statistics generated enthusiastic applause, but what struck Zoe more was the pride in Aria's voice. The same transformation she had witnessed in hundreds of program participants who had discovered that their knowledge became more valuable when shared and connected, rather than hoarded and isolated. Captain Blackwood stood to address the conference from his position as the Pentagon's Director of Civilian Military Integration Programs. Dr. Nakamura-Chen, I want to share some information that I think will interest this audience. The Department of Defense has received requests from 43 allied nations to implement versions of integration training for their own military and civilian personnel. The international expansion of integration training represented validation beyond anything Zoe had imagined when she'd first agreed to consult on Hassan's psychological warfare tactics. But it also represented a responsibility she felt keenly, ensuring that integration approaches were used to enhance rather than exploit the communities they were designed to serve. Captain Blackwood, that's both exciting and concerning, she replied. Integration training is only effective when it's applied with genuine commitment to serving others rather than dominating them. How do we ensure that international applications maintain those ethical foundations? By doing exactly what you've done here, he replied, by making sure that integration training programs are developed and led by people who understand that expertise exists to serve communities, not to control them. Master Sergeant Kane, now retired and serving as a civilian instructor in the program, stood to share an observation that had emerged from his experience training veterans in integration approaches. Dr. Nakamura-Chen, I've been working with veterans who are struggling with the transition to civilian life, and I've noticed something important. The ones who succeed aren't the ones who abandon their military identity or the ones who refuse to adapt to civilian contexts. The ones who succeed are the ones who learn to integrate both identities in service of something larger than themselves. The observation touched something fundamental about Zoe's own experience and the experiences of countless veterans who had participated in integration training programs. The false choice between military and civilian identities, the choice Hassan had tried to force through psychological warfare, dissolved when people learned that their different experiences could enhance rather than compete with each other. Master Sergeant Kane, that's exactly right. And it applies beyond military-civilian transitions. Anytime people are told they have to choose between different aspects of their identity or experience, they're usually being manipulated by someone who benefits from keeping them divided and weak. As the conference continued with presentations from participants who had applied integration training to healthcare, education, disaster response, and community development, Zoe reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The scared college student who had hidden her military background was gone. The isolated EOD specialist who had left Afghanistan was gone. In their place stood someone who had learned that strength came from integration rather than compartmentalization, from connection rather than isolation. Her phone buzzed with a message from Maria Santos, the former helicopter pilot who was now leading integration training programs in wildfire response. Just wanted you to know, yesterday we saved 12 hikers trapped by a flash fire using integrated aviation and ground rescue techniques. None of those people would be alive today without their approaches you taught us.
The message represented everything Zoe had hoped to accomplish through integration training, not personal recognition or institutional advancement, but the practical application of connected expertise to protect and serve others. Each success story represented lives saved, communities strengthened, and people empowered to use their knowledge in service of others. As the conference concluded with commitments to expand integration training programs worldwide, Zoe found herself standing with Agent Walsh, Captain Blackwood, and Professor Winters, representatives of the different worlds that had shaped her identity and that she had learned to bridge through her work. Dr. Nakamura-Chen, I have one final update on the Hassan case. The intelligence we gathered during his prosecution led to the identification and arrest of 17 other individuals who were planning similar psychological warfare attacks against veterans in civilian careers. The news that her confrontation with Hassan had prevented additional attacks felt like closure for the traumatic events that had forced her back into military services 18 months earlier. But it also felt like validation for the integration training approach that had emerged from those events.
Agent Walsh, that's gratifying, but I think the most important outcome isn't the arrests. It's the fact that hundreds of veterans now have the tools to recognize and counter psychological warfare tactics designed to exploit their identity transitions. Captain Blackwood nodded his agreement. What you've developed here isn't just training, it's immunity. People who understand integration principles can't be manipulated by adversaries who try to force false choices between different aspects of their identity. Professor Winters smiled with the satisfaction of an educator who had watched a student exceed every expectation. Zoe, when you first arrived at Mountain View University, you thought you were escaping your military identity to build a civilian one. What you actually did was learn to integrate both identities in service of something more powerful than either one alone. As Zoe walked across the campus quad that evening, past students preparing for final exams and international visitors discussing integration training applications, she reflected on the question that had haunted her since that night when Hassan's psychological warfare had forced her to choose between her concealed military expertise and her civilian aspirations. The choice had been false from the beginning. She hadn't needed to choose between being a college student and being a bomb disposal expert, between pursuing peaceful applications for technical knowledge and maintaining the capability to protect others from violence, between building civilian connections and honoring military service. She had needed to learn that all of these aspects of her identity could work together to create something more effective than any of them alone. Someone who could save children's lives precisely because she had learned to integrate rather than compartmentalize different forms of expertise and experience. Her phone buzzed with a text from her former floormates, who had maintained their friendship despite the dramatic changes in all their lives. Dinner tomorrow to celebrate the first anniversary of the night that changed everything? We'll provide the pizza if you promise not to diffuse anything. Zoe smiled as she typed her response. Just dinner. No explosives involved, I promise. But as she looked around at the campus that had become an international center for integration training, at the program participants who were applying connected expertise to serve communities worldwide, and at the future full of possibilities for people who had learned that their different experiences made them stronger rather than weaker, she realized that the real explosion had already happened. It had been the explosion of the false barriers that had kept different forms of knowledge and experience isolated from each other. And the fallout from that explosion would continue to generate new possibilities for protection, service, and connection for years to come. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.